All right, let's get right into it. To be found guilty of a crime, it's not enough to just have a bad thought. Nope, you actually have to do something. Today, we're going to break down that doing part, the physical component of a crime. In the legal world, they call it Actus Reus.
So let's kick things off with a big question, one that gets right to the heart of this. Can you actually be punished just for a thought? You have this terrible idea about someone, but you never lift a finger to act on it. Can the law really reach inside your head and punish you for that? The answer is a huge, resounding no. And figuring out why is exactly how we're going to understand Actus Reus.
Okay, so when you look at almost any crime, the law breaks it down into two essential pieces. You've got the mens rea, which is just fancy Latin for the guilty mind. That's your intent. And then you've got what we're talking about today, the actus reus, the guilty act. That's the physical part, the thing that actually happens in the real world. And here's the kicker. You absolutely have to have both. Without the act, there's just no crime, period.
So, that brings us to our first major principle, the guilty act requirement. This is about way more than just a bad thought.
Now, here's what's so important to get your head around. The term actus reus sounds simple, but it's actually pretty broad. It's not just one thing. It can be the conduct itself, the physical movement, like swinging a baseball bat. It can also be the result of that action, like the window that gets smashed. And sometimes, it even includes the specific circumstances around the act. It's the whole shebang of what happened.
And this leads us to a really critical line the law has to draw, one that's actually based in the Constitution. It's the difference between someone's status and their action. So, for example, the government can't make it a crime just to be a certain type of person, like a vagrant. That's a status. But what they can do is make it a crime to commit a specific act, like loitering. It seems like a small difference, but it's huge. It's all about punishing what you do, not who you are.
All right, so we've established we need an act. But there's a catch. This is about a conscious, voluntary act. Turns out, not all actions are created equal. So what does the law consider involuntary? Well, think about any situation where your conscious mind just isn't driving the bus. We're talking about things like sleepwalking, or a sudden reflex, maybe a seizure, or even a situation where somebody else physically forces your body to move. If you're not in control, it's not a voluntary act.
And this quote is just the perfect way to picture it, right? If my doctor taps my knee and my leg swings up and kicks him, I shouldn't have to face criminal charges. Exactly. You didn't decide to kick him. It was a pure reflex. Your body just did it. That is not a voluntary act, so it can't be the actus reus for a crime like battery. The requirement just isn't met.
Okay, so up to this point, we've been talking all about how a crime needs a voluntary action. But what about doing nothing at all? Can doing nothing be a crime? It sounds kind of crazy, right? But believe it or not, in some very specific situations, your failure to act is the crime. This is where the law gets really, really interesting. I mean, listen to this quote. I can pull up a lawn chair and a can of Dr. Pepper and watch it happen. This illustrates a really shocking but totally fundamental rule in American law. Imagine you see a stranger's baby drowning in a shallow pool. Legally speaking, you can do exactly that. You can just sit there and watch. Now, you might be a terrible person, but from a criminal law standpoint, you haven't committed a crime.
And that's because of this general rule. It might seem harsh, but here it is. The law imposes no affirmative duty to act. Our legal system generally does not force you to be a good Samaritan. There's no broad, sweeping duty to rescue a stranger who's in trouble.
So that obviously leads to the next big question, right? If the default rule is that you don't have to do anything, when does that change? When are you legally required to act? When does just sitting there cross the line and become a crime? And the answer comes down to something the law calls a legal duty. So while you don't have a general duty to just help anybody and everybody, there are 5 very specific situations where the law says, yep, you have to act. And if you're in one of those 5 situations and you don't, your inaction can actually count as the actus reus of a crime.
So here they are, the 5 sources of a legal duty to act. Let's break them down. First, there's a status relationship. Think parent and child. If that's your baby in the pool, you absolutely have a duty to act. Second, a statute can create a duty. Like some traffic laws say you have to stop and help at an accident you're involved in. Third is a contract. The classic example is a lifeguard on duty. They're paid to rescue people, so they can't just sit there. Fourth, a voluntary assumption of care. This is interesting. If you start to help someone, you can create a duty to see it through. You can't just start a rescue and then walk away. And finally, number 5, creation of peril. If you created the danger in the first place, even by accident, you now have a duty to help.
All right, we're almost there. Just one last piece to this puzzle. We've got the guilty mind, the mens rea, and we've got the guilty act, the actus reus. But for a crime to actually happen, those two things have to link up at the same time. The law calls this final check concurrence. These two scenarios make it super clear. Look at scenario 1 on the left. A guy decides to run over his wife, and then he does it. The intent to kill and the act of killing are happening together. That's concurrence. That's murder. Now look at the right. This is wild. One night he wants her dead, but he forgets about it. The next morning, he accidentally runs her over. See the difference? He had a guilty mind at one point, and he committed a guilty act later, but they weren't connected. There's no concurrence, so it's not intentional murder.
Okay, let's wrap this up. It's time to boil it all down to the key takeaways. If you're going to master Actus Reus, these are the big ideas you need to remember.
So here are the core principles. Number 1, a crime requires a voluntary act, not just a thought and not just who you are. Number 2, remember, the general rule is you have no duty to act or help others. Number 3, that failure to act only becomes a crime when one of those 5 special legal duties exists. And finally, number 4, the guilty act and the guilty mind have to be connected. That's concurrence.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty deep question to chew on. Where exactly should the law draw the line between a moral duty to help someone and a legal one? We've seen what the law says now, but is that right? Think back to that stranger's drowning baby. It's a tough situation. Should the law actually force us to be good Samaritans? It really gets you thinking about what law is for and where personal freedom ends and our duty to others begins.